You know, when we think about global power, our minds usually jump to things like armies, economies, and big ideologies. But what if the real engine driving history has always been something more basic? In this explainer, we're going to trace the hidden story of conflict, from 19th century coal ships all the way to 21st century battery factories, to see how the fight for energy has shaped and continues to shape our world.
This idea really reframes everything, doesn't it? Energy isn't just one more thing countries trade. It's the literal foundation that our entire modern world is built on. It's what powers our industries, our transportation, our military might, and our political stability. When you have a secure supply, you can grow and project power. But the moment that supply is threatened, well, even the strongest nations suddenly find their limits.
And that's the real key here. The fundamental game of power hasn't changed a bit. The technologies change, the fuels change, but the core logic stays exactly the same. Whether you're controlling a network of coal ports in the 1800s, dominating oil shipping lanes in the 1970s, or building most of the world's batteries today, the goal is always the same. Control the fuel, the route, or the technology, and you get to shape the system everyone else relies on.
Okay, so let's break down this core pattern, because I promise once you see it, you'll start to notice this hidden engine driving competition absolutely everywhere throughout history.
It all boils down to one simple fact: asymmetry. The stuff we need for energy, the resources, the best routes to move them, and the tech to use them, is not spread evenly around the planet. Not even close. And that imbalance is the root of this entire geopolitical game. It automatically creates haves and have-nots, giving some countries incredible leverage and making others deeply vulnerable.
And this imbalance drives a really predictable cycle. First, some kind of shock happens, a war, a blockade, maybe an embargo, and it suddenly exposes just how dependent a country is on someone else. Then, that shock forces the nation to adapt. They scramble to find new suppliers, build new pipelines, or invent new technologies. And sure, this solves the immediate problem, but, as we're about to see, it almost always creates a totally new kind of dependency down the road.
All right, let's take this framework and jump back in time to the 19th century. Let's see how this all played out with the fuel that powered the first truly global empires: coal.
So in the 1800s, coal was king. It was everything. It powered the factories of the Industrial Revolution, the new railways, and most critically, the massive new steam-powered navies. But this incredible power created a brand new strategic problem. A warship could only go as far as its coal bunkers would let it. A fleet without fuel was basically just a bunch of floating targets. All of a sudden, naval planning was energy planning.
And this gets to the heart of the logic of that era. It wasn't enough to just have the biggest, baddest ships. You had to have the best infrastructure to keep them moving. A global network of fortified naval coaling stations, stretching from Malta to Singapore, these became the essential nodes of imperial power. If you controlled the ports, you controlled the oceans. Simple as that.
And you can see how this idea just morphs into the next era. The specific asset changes, right? A fortified coaling station becomes a narrow maritime choke point like the Strait of Hormuz. But the underlying game, it's identical. It's all about controlling those critical nodes in the energy supply chain.
Which brings us to the 20th century, and to oil, what some called the fuel of motion. This is where the competition escalates from being a tricky logistics problem for navies into a full-blown, high-stakes global contest.
Oil just completely changed the game. Suddenly, cars, tanks, and airplanes all ran on it. This new, intense dependency turned resource-rich places like the Middle East into the absolute center of the global chessboard. And what happened? The producer states banded together to form OPEC to control the supply, while the big consumer nations built up huge strategic reserves to protect themselves. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It was officially a weapon. And the year 1973 is the moment this becomes impossible to ignore. The Arab oil embargo was the shock that laid bare the deep, deep dependence of the entire industrialized world. It was a brutal lesson that energy supply wasn't some simple market issue, it was a core national security vulnerability. This is that coercion adaptation cycle we talked about in action. The shock of the embargo forced nations to adapt by creating strategic reserves and agencies like the IEA.
And that brings us all the way to today. You know, it's tempting to think that the big transition to green energy will finally end this centuries-long competition. But the reality is, the transition isn't ending the game. It's just shifting the battle to a new front line: batteries and the critical minerals needed to make them.
Look at how the playing field has changed. The critical resources aren't just crude oil anymore. They're minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel. The new choke points aren't narrow shipping straits patrolled by navies. They're the highly concentrated factories where these minerals get processed. And the dominant players? They're no longer just the oil-producing states. They're the countries that lead in manufacturing and technology.
And right here, this is the new asymmetry. China's overwhelming 75% share of battery manufacturing, that's the modern-day equivalent of controlling the world's oil reserves a century ago. It creates a powerful new form of leverage. It's the ability to influence not just the price of batteries, but the technological standards for the entire green transition, a power very similar to what OPEC had back in 1973.
So what's the response from everyone else? Well, we're seeing that cycle repeat itself perfectly. Policies like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and similar big programs in the EU are classic adaptation. They are massive industrial strategies designed for one specific reason: to reduce this new dependency and bring the critical infrastructure of the next energy era back home.
So after all this, you have to ask, why does this game endure? Why does the rivalry just keep going, just changing its clothes from coal to oil to batteries?
Well, the reasons are deep and they're structural. First, energy is the ultimate input. It powers literally everything else in an economy. Its resources are also concentrated in just a few places, which creates natural winners and losers. The massive infrastructure it needs, think pipelines or gigafactories, creates a lock-in that lasts for decades. Plus, it fuels both the civilian economy and the military. And finally, it's tied directly to a government's bank account and its political stability. That's why energy can never, ever be just another commodity.
So the big takeaway here is this: the world may be moving past old fuels, but it is not moving past the geopolitical need to control the systems that make power possible. And that leaves us with a huge critical question. As we invest trillions of dollars to build the clean energy infrastructure of the future, we have to ask ourselves, are we just designing a greener world, or are we unintentionally drawing the map for the next century of conflict?